So if you produce deep and hypnotic techno and you always wanted to know how artists like Luigi Tozzi or Edit Select produce these organic, textured, rich sounding drums, then this video is exactly what you need. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you the step-by-step process on how to create deep hypnotic techno drums and percussions in Ableton Live. So here's what we're going to create. Let's start with the kick drum. I've muted all the drum tops and we only have kick, bass and 2 different pad sounds. Now in hypnotic techno, the kick drum is not as critical as in some other genres of techno. I think the most important thing is that it doesn't get in the way of everything else. You want it to be present, you also want to feel it in the club, but you don't want it to grab the attention of the listener too much. Right now, I like this kick drum sample that I've used, but it almost sounds a little bit too clicky, a little bit too aggressive. So the only thing I have to do here is basically use an EQ or auto filter and filter out a tiny bit of the top ends. And for now, that's good. So remember this, you want a kick that doesn't get in the way of the rest and just creates this nice foundation for the other things to sit on top. Now with hypnotic techno, the interesting stuff actually happens in the drum tops. So all the percussions, hats and so on. But before we get there, if you struggle with finishing songs consistently, I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework, my 3 simple steps that help you finish at least 1 great sounding song per month. You can get this at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description. It's entirely for free. And now let's get back to the tutorial. Let's now open up our drum tops group and I'm going to walk you through this step by step. The first thing that I want you to add to your hypnotic techno drums is some kind of a textured percussive ambience. So in this case, I've used a vinyl crackle and a fire sound crackle, so like a bonfire. And both of them are just fed into the track very gently. I will show you what this sounds like. So here's the vinyl crackle. This is the fire. You can tell both of them are kind of random and playing nicely together. What I personally like to do is to use an auto filter, put it on the more prominent ones, for example, the vinyl crackle. And I put this in bandpass mode. And I use a little bit of an LFO, so that means the filter is going to move back and forth. Let's now listen to this. And I'm intentionally not setting this to any musical signature. I think it's very cool if this is randomly moving in the background. What I also like to do is to send both of those into a reverb send that I've created. So here is our hybrid reverb. The exact settings don't matter, just use a reverb that is not too close, but also maybe not a huge cathedral. By the way, I've made a cool video about reverbs if you want to dive super deep into this. Now let's listen to this. And in context. So it already gives me this satisfying, deep feeling that I'm immersed in the sound. I really love this. It's a super simple trick, but it already adds the right kind of flavor to your drum tops. But now it starts to get really interesting. We're going to add in open hi-hats and closed hi-hats. So first of all, let's start with the open hi-hat. So the typical pattern. Now, this is too rigid, obviously. And I've just used the drum sampler here from Ableton. And I've dialed in my opinion, a really good setting for a hi-hat. It is not too sharp, but it's also not too loose. That's kind of in the middle. It's very precise. It still sounds like an open hi-hat and not so much like a closed hi-hat. And this is important. With hypnotic techno, everything is so immersive that you want some elements to actually be precise and guide you through the song. If everything is fed into reverb, if everything is super heavily modulated, then I think you get lost in all of that. You need a little bit of stability. And this is where I say the open hi-hat needs to be relatively precise and have a little bit of groundedness and power. But what you can still do is you can modulate it a tiny bit so that it just doesn't sound too rigid. So I'm going to grab the LFO tool here. We're going to map this LFO to the decay. So some of the hi-hat hits will be longer, some of them will be a bit shorter. Now, this is too extreme, obviously, but you can adjust the depth here. So that means just a tiny bit of variation, as you can see here. And in terms of offset, you can also just dial in where this is starting. If you want it to be even more random, then you can use the random wave. A little bit of this into the reverb, but not too much, because this, as I've said, needs to provide a bit of stability. Just quickly, if you got any value out of this video so far, then consider subscribing to the channel, consider liking this video. It really helps me stay on track with new content, and it will also help you because YouTube will suggest similar videos to you and we both win. Now let's get back to the tutorial. Let's move on to the closed hi-hat, and this is where the fun stuff really begins. Because the closed hi-hat needs to create a little bit of a backbeat, but in a very typical way. So if I just put in the MIDI notes, and let's say I use the 16th, so I want to have a fast closed hi-hat, it would just sound way too rigid. And so what I do is I only put a MIDI note on every beginning of every quarter note. So it's basically doubling the kick drum. Sound design is a relatively sharp hi-hat. I've dialed this in with the drum synth. Now what you want to do is grab an echo, put this as the first effect in your chain here. The interesting thing here is you have to dial in something that is relatively fast and creates a backbeat behind this original sound. So for example, I use this one as a dotted 8th note and this one as a straight 16th note to get a little bit of variation between left and right. And what you can also do is you can speed it up and slow it down a tiny bit, just to make sure that it's not too perfect. Now, I suppose this sounds familiar. You can then go into the modulation, use a little bit of filtering and delaying. So the whole purpose here is to humanize this a tiny bit. Obviously, there's much more you can do. So this is just the absolute foundation. Let's talk about the steps to make this really sound great. One of my favorite tools to use here is the erosion plugin. Erosion infuses a band of noise. And already you can tell that this is creating a little bit of a texture in here. If you use the LFO tool and map the LFO to the frequency, it's going to change accordingly. You can also bring this before the echo if you want. You can offset this a little bit so that it's just on the kind of top side of the spectrum. And sometimes I like to smoothen the LFO a little bit. The secret weapon in Hypnotic Techno is Flanger Phaser tool, especially if you put it into doubler mode. And I only add in a little bit of that with the wet dry knob, so I'm mixing in a bit of that effect. And once again, you can decide if you want to have this before the echo or after the echo. This obviously affects how the overall output sound of this is. So let's listen to this in context. If If you want this to be modulated even more, you can use yet again an LFO tool or map the same LFO tool to something else. For example, map it to the decay here and let this also change, or to the pitch. So all of that is possible. Now this is too extreme, obviously, so I would use a different one. I'll just bring it here to the very beginning of the chain so we have everything together. So let's map this, for example, to the pitch and only modulate it a tiny bit. And we get this textured, rich background sound here. If you use even more of the erosion plugin, a little bit more noise-infused hi-hat sounds, then it gets denser. If you want to use it more sparsely, then you reduce this amount of noise. But yeah, that's one of the secret weapons here. So far, we have relatively straight sounds, but in Hypnotic Techno, you want to have a little bit of polymeter stuff also going on. I will introduce you to a noise hit. I've also created this just using the sampler and infusing it with a little bit of a noise sample that I found. And the cool thing is with the sampler, you can shape these things in different ways. So for example, it sounded like this originally. You can change the decay, you can change the shape. Can pitch it up or down. And this is, by the way, a cool trick. You can add an LFO and map it to, for example, the pitch here. And you get these nice granular sounds. But the interesting thing here is not only the sound design, but also the rhythm. Because what I've done here is I've intentionally made the bar a little bit shorter. So you get this dotted eighth feel, and it sounds very, very nice, I think, because it's evolving differently to everything else. And also the rhythm is slightly different than compared to everything else. And this is what makes Hypnotic Techno so interesting. The stuff is evolving in unexpected ways and also sometimes unpredictable ways. Now this gets already quite dense, but in some parts you want to bring it one notch up and increase the intensity even more, and this is where the last two layers come in. So we have a ride layer here, and the cool thing about the ride is that you don't have to do a lot, you just have to pick a sample that sounds good enough. Now typically this would come in like this when you load it into the sampler. Like a little bit too snappy, but the cool thing is with the sampler you can use a little bit of attack, a little bit of release, and it starts to sound much smoother already. So you have a little bit of that snap sound, and then the rest just rings out nicely. Obviously I would send it into reverb. But maybe not even use the hybrid reverb, but give it its own little reverb. So I would go for something that's plate-like. So let's go to plates, rich plate. Let's use the shimmer for the algorithm. Now the reason I'm using these settings is because I want to have something that's textured, that's rich. Once again, I can recommend my reverb video if you want to know a bit more about why I'm dialing in certain sounds in a certain way. So this is really nice and lush. The problem here is that the pattern is still a little bit too stale, a little bit too boring. So what I would do is I would lengthen this and just add a little bit of variation. This is the one way to do this. Or once again, like I told you, you can use something like the velocity plugin. And what you can do here is you can use this randomize function. So some of the MIDI notes will be softer, some of them will be harder hitting. You can see it here. And you can also obviously change the range. Now this is stopping a bit too abruptly, so what I can do is I can just lengthen this here. So all the notes can ring out. This is quite important to know with a sampler. Cool, so let's listen to that in context. So if you feel like everything's too centered, which sometimes can be a problem in hypnotic techno, then you can use the auto pen. You have to be careful with this. This can mess with your face quite a bit if you overdo it. Yeah, fantastic. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the toms, and the interesting thing is that toms are often used in the context of hypnotic techno to actually give a little bit more emphasis to the low end. I'm going to show you how. So very often toms are used to create a little bit of a low end groove and push in the bass region. This is a very nice technique in hypnotic techno. So let's listen to this first. As you can tell, nothing special about the sample. First thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to pitch this down a bit. Maybe a bit too deep. And we're going to filter this. Add a little bit of variation. And sometimes it's nice to use the OSR filter that has a little bit of drive to just give it a certain texture. I like this a lot. But still, it's right now rhythmically playing together with the kick drum. So it doesn't really make sense. What we will do is we will use an echo once again. Here it's really important to use it in ping pong mode and actually try to get it out of the center as much as possible. So we'll use this in completely wet dry or almost completely wet dry. If it gets too high, then you can just bring this filter down or decrease the LFO amount. Also a little bit too loud, obviously. So I'll just bring this in a tiny bit using the output. Now you can use this up to taste how much you want of this in your mix. Obviously there is a way to push it with a little bit of saturation and make this like a really important element of your groove. This is definitely possible. So I'm going to use the hard curve. Now you have to be careful that this is not flooding your low end. I think it adds a really nice groove and texture. If you feel like it's getting too overwhelming, you could, for example, use a gate after that, or using an LFO tool to duck it behind the kick drum and make sure that it kind of ebbs and flows with the kick. Right now with this sample, I think it's totally fine. It's absolutely doable like this. What's super cool about all these drum layers is that they allow you to paint an arrangement with these elements. I'm not going to do a full arrangement. This is going to happen in one of the next videos. But right now I can show you that by muting and unmuting some of these sounds, you can create amazing arrangements. So let's just quickly do this. So I will leave the vinyl crackle on and the fire crackle, and then with the rest we'll see. So that is it. Thanks for watching. Before you leave, make sure to leave a comment below and let me know what you found helpful here. Also let me know what types of new content you want from me. I'm thinking about doing an arrangement tutorial as well, so leave a comment below if you want to see this, and I will see you in the next video.